Hey everyone, this is Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Sleepwalker, issues 13 through 16. This was a storyline called Color Blindness, and it went from June of 1992 to September of 1992. And it's probably one of my favorite storylines in the Sleepwalker series because up until this point, things had been getting to a gradually darker turn within the series. The prejudice that Sleepwalker dealt with in terms of how humanity tended to view him in general was really getting to him, and his desire to return to his home in the mindscape was weighing on him as well. But him being a sort of law enforcement officer of a other dimensional plane, and being put in a situation wherein he was tasked with safeguarding the mind of Rick Sheridan, it was something that kind of played havoc with him because, as you see as the series goes on, he takes his responsibility seriously in a sense that he is trying to safeguard Rick's mind from outside forces, but he's also trying to do his job as some form of, the equivalent of a law enforcement officer, in the sense that whenever Rick sleeps, Sleepwalker comes out of Rick's mind and basically patrols the city and looks for crime to prevent or confront. And so it took him a bit of time, but he eventually learned enough about Earth and humanity in terms of how to function. But unfortunately, he still tends to meet with fear and prejudice when it comes to, say, everyday folk interacting with him. Although, as one of the previous story arcs demonstrated, some of the people that Sleepwalker had actually saved in his efforts to fight crime remembered him and kind of went out of their way to say that, hey, this guy's not a monster. But unfortunately, they tended to be in the minority. Whereas most of the other people, they see a big green bug-eyed alien, they're going to be like, monster, monster, kill. I mean, this is the same universe and same setting, which the X-Men are constantly being feared and persecuted, even though they don't really look too outlandish themselves. So if humanity's going to go apeshit over ordinary looking X-Men, I mean, what do you think they're going to do with this guy? And to be fair, Sleepwalker does look pretty freaky here, but that kind of ties into what the overall story is of this series, and it actually deals with themes of addiction, except you're kind of seeing it from an alien standpoint, and it's unfortunately Sleepwalker who has to go through the process of addiction within this story. So Color Blindness basically starts off wherein he's going through his the mind of Rick Sheridan, trying to find some way to kill time, but he's also trying to find a way out of his situation, because he knows that his device, the Imaginator, which basically allowed him to navigate various planes of the mindscape, was lost somewhere within the mind of Rick Sheridan, but so far he has yet to be able to find it. And at one point within one of the issues of the series, he met Ricky, who was basically a younger version, a child version of Rick Sheridan, and the two of them kind of became friends. And Ricky was showing Sleepwalker around the remnants of Rick's memories. But this is at this point, starting with issue 13, Sleepwalker is getting more and more desperate to find his Imaginator so he can make his way home. Because unfortunately, while he does take his job seriously as a sort of law enforcement officer of the mindscape, the fact that he's cut off from the mindscape and is basically confined to the mind of Rick Sheridan whenever Rick is asleep, and the only time he's able to come out of Rick's mind is when Rick sleeps. But unfortunately, though, he feels that he's exchanging one prison for another, in the sense that while he is able to interact with the outside world once Rick is asleep, most of his interactions with humanity have been, negative, with a few positive exceptions giving him some reason to, try and, continue his, self-appointed mission. At least in this instance of him being in a stranger in a strange land, yet still trying to, have a semblance of purpose and duty. But yeah, it's gotten to a point where it's really eating at him, and so when he's asking Ricky to try and help him find this device, I mean, Ricky so far, he himself hasn't seen it, but he tries to reassure Sleepwalker that he'll keep an eye out for it, and so around this time, back in the real world, Rick Sheridan's kind of going through a point where he and his former girlfriend Alyssa had broken up, but she was unfortunately going out with this sort of jerk jock named Whitney, who is basically your jerk jock personified. But Rick knows that Whitney's not really a good guy, but he also gets the distinct impression that if he tries to sort of horn in on Alyssa and Whitney, I mean, it'll just kind of backfire and blow up in his face. And so he just sort of, tries to go on with his life, even though he has to contend with, watching, his former girlfriend, go out with a guy who's a complete sleazebag. But on the other hand, though, Alyssa is starting to realize that Whitney himself is a sleazebag as well. And so, she's not above interacting with her former boyfriend Rick, because the two of them, they were close for a certain amount of time, and so the two of them, they talk about maybe getting together, trying to talk over coffee and what have you, but just to sort of reconnect, but also maybe just to clear the air on some stuff, because apparently Alyssa, I mean, and Rick were wanting different things, except Rick didn't really count on having an alien from another dimension stuck in his mind, which really threw things off with Alyssa. But ironically, while Alyssa had a lot of issues with Rick at this point in time because of the fact that he was missing out on the time he was supposed to be with her, unknown to her, it was because Sleepwalker was sort of altering things within Rick's life, and Alyssa turned out to be one of the few humans thus far that looked at Sleepwalker from the standpoint of not being judgmental, and basically was saying, hey, this guy's proved that he's a hero, that kind of thing. But Rick has yet to tell Alyssa that Sleepwalker's in his mind, and that's why for a bit there, the two of them, he and Alyssa, just seemed to go separate ways. But it was because Sleepwalker was kind of playing havoc with his life, but not by intention though. And so while Rick and Alyssa make plans to meet and get together and try and sort some things out, Sleepwalker, on his next night out, once Rick falls asleep, he's sort of lost in thought while patrolling the city, but he comes across a spectacular display of lights coming from a certain building, and once he checks it out, something about the lights draws him to this particular building. And it turns out that the lights are coming from an experiment being conducted by a gentleman named Dr. Charles Warren Fong and his assistant, Selena Slate. And the two of them are working with a synthetic diamond in order to experiment with something called discrete full spectrum dispersal. And what Fong is wanting to do is he's wanting to use this synthetic diamond to examine the individual properties of each beam of each spectrum of light that is affected by the diamond. And the explanation, I mean, it's a little more in depth within the comic, but I did appreciate how Bob Budiansky seem to be tapping into some genuine science here, but I actually wrote it down. Give me a sec here. So the process, it was called discrete full spectrum dispersal, and the structure of the synthetic diamond, quote unquote, allows pure white light to be broken down into its component colors, which allows for the discovery of properties inherent in each individual color. And so, once Sleepwalker makes himself known to the two of them, they're initially thrown off because here's this big green guy, coming down into their building, into their room in which they're conducting the experiments. But Sleepwalker, introduces himself and just he starts talking with Dr. Fong and asking him about the light. And so once Dr. Fong explains what's going on, Sleepwalker seems to be intrigued by all this, but he finds himself being drawn to the diamond itself, as well as the lights coming from it. And it turns out that this light, as they find out later, a certain spectrum of the light, once it makes contact with Sleepwalker through this diamond, actually has an addictive effect on him. And it provides him a sense of bliss, and contentment, which he has not had, ever since coming into Rick's mind. But at this point in time, though, at first it's just a bit of a quirk, but once Rick wakes up, Sleepwalker finds himself drawn back into Rick's mind, and Dr. Fong and Selena Slate, they're both like, oh, he just disappeared. Where'd he go? And Slate, she's all, like, well, hey, good riddance to him. He was really weird. And Dr. Fong actually kind of liked Sleepwalker because he's like, yeah, he's a little weird, but in his own way, I found him to be an inquisitive, gentle soul, that kind of thing. So it's like he appreciated the fact that someone was wanting to learn about science, and so it's like, so what if it was a big green alien, that kind of thing. But, unfortunately, though, Sleepwalker is less than happy with this because once he's back in the mind of Rick, he tracks down young Ricky and forces him to find a way to make Rick Sheridan fall asleep so he can come back out and go back to the light, or back to the lab of Dr. Fong, where he can come into contact with the light again. And so Ricky actually says, okay, I'm only going to do this once, because if I do it too much, it can really screw up the big guy being, Rick Sheridan. And so he finds this memory of this ancient senior citizen lady, who was a school teacher of Rick's, back in the day when he was a kid, who, she almost always, put her class to sleep whenever she, read poetry. And so Ricky taps into that memory and the feeling of boredom and sleepiness that it would always hit Rick with. And so once he does that, that's what causes Rick to fall asleep. And it turns out it's right when he's taking the train to go meet Alyssa to try and talk things out. But fortunately, though, this being the daytime, he falls asleep on the train in the day, totally misses the meeting with Alyssa. And of course, she's thinking that Rick deliberately stood her up because on one hand, she understands that, hey, if Rick's mad at me, that's one thing, but standing me up like this, And so make it that what you will. It kind of depends on, how you perceive things as a reader, but was Rick in the right or was Alyssa in the right? Were they both wrong? That kind of thing. But then again, this was literally outside of Rick's control. So Sleepwalker finds himself, back in the real world, but in the daytime, which is usually something that does not happen. But, at this point, he gets a chance to go back to Dr. Fong's lab to, and there goes my skull. But, or my head. Skull, head, same difference. But anyway, he goes back to the lab, surprising both Dr. Fong and Selena. And so they're both like, I thought he only came out during the night. And so Dr. Fong kind of improvises and shows him more, about, the experiments they're trying to do. And so, unfortunately, though, it's becoming very obvious that the light is having an addictive effect on Sleepwalker because at one point he says, I could sit and stare at this diamond for hours, and the lights that coming from it. And so, Dr. Fong says, well, actually, you already have. And so, he sort of tries to distract Sleepwalker by showing him how each of the individual spectrums of light have, due to their experiments, have a certain property to them. Like one beam of light, one spectrum, for example, it allows for there to be, say, a hologram of an object. Like, for example, if the spectrum of light hits a coffee cup, then it can make a holographic duplicate right next to it. And another spectrum of light, for example, is strong enough to shoot through a block of steel, and another spectrum of light is able to coat the surface of whatever it's aimed at in ice, and so on and so forth. And while Sleepwalker definitely finds this stuff intriguing, he's just wanting to sit and bask in the light. But at some point, Rick wakes up because once the train gets to its final stop, the conductor is like, "Hey, buddy, don't know where you were supposed to go, but you dozed off." And so Rick's like, "Oh crap, I missed out on making up with Alyssa." But so he makes his way home, and at this point, Sleepwalker, he's back inside Rick's mind. He's raging and wanting to get out, and demanding that Ricky tap into another memory to make Rick fall asleep. And Ricky's like, I told you I'm only going to do that once, because any more than that, it could really hurt the big guy. And so unfortunately, Sleepwalker, basically being beyond reason at this point, starts tearing apart the fragments of Rick's mind in an effort to force Rick to fall asleep. And so unfortunately, this actually ends up putting Rick into a coma. And so but once he's back in the real world, though, at this point he doesn't know that Rick's in a coma, but he goes back to the lab, and it's one of those instances where it's sort of a good news, bad news thing. The good news is his presence actually saved Dr. Fong's life, because it turns out that his assistant, Selena, was in league with a burglar who had tried to get into the building earlier. And it turns out this burglar is her boyfriend as well. But he was wanting to use her connections with Dr. Fong's lab to get the diamond so he could fence it. But when Sleepwalker, got in there to get to the light, his interference actually manages to prevent Selena's boyfriend from killing Dr. Fong. But unfortunately, though, he's so overcome with his addiction for the light that he's basically just not at his full power. He's at his full power, but he's not in full control. And amidst the chaos, Selena, she ends up getting a hold of the diamond after her partner slash boyfriend has just been thoroughly thrashed by Sleepwalker. And Dr. Fong, he's warning her not to touch it because it's still plugged into the system, but she ignores his warning and basically is hit with all the spectrums at once. But somehow, instead of killing her, they all sort of just connect to her and bind together to where as she's holding this diamond, she essentially becomes this sort of living rainbow almost. And in her insanity that's been brought on by this newfound power, she takes on the name Spectra, and basically she's too powerful for Sleepwalker in his current state to defeat. And so she gets her boyfriend slash partner out of the building, away from Sleepwalker and Dr. Fong. But once they get back to their place, once she sort of starts to think about things, she realizes that her boyfriend, the only reason he was wanting to fence the diamond was just to get more money for drugs, because it turns out he is an addict as well. And she herself was kind of, addicted to this sort of, toxic relationship that the two of them had been in. And so, in her, newfound, state of power, she basically, just, blows the guy away. I mean, doesn't kill him, but, hurts him really badly, and, flies out of the building, leaving her, toxic relationship behind. And as she goes off with the diamond, Dr. Fong, tries to get Sleepwalker to see reason, because unfortunately, Sleepwalker, while he's unwilling to see reason initially, the fact that he's outside of Rick's mind is actually, weakening him physically. And so Dr. Fong finds himself in the role of impromptu nursemaid, with trying to help Sleepwalker, and the two of them find Rick. Actually, no, Sleepwalker finds Rick collapsed when wherever it was he fell. Whenever Sleepwalker basically started tearing apart fragments of Rick's mind just to make him fall asleep. And so once Sleepwalker realizes what he's done, he brings Rick to Dr. Fong, begging him to help them. And so Dr. Fong, he's able to have medical personnel come in and get Rick to a hospital, where he's unfortunately in a deep coma, but he should be able to pull through, considering that he's overall a healthy young man. But in the meantime, though, I mean, he tries to sit down and talk to Sleepwalker about what's going on with him, saying that, hey, you're addicted to this spectrum of light, and it's what we humans call addiction. And Sleepwalker it was basically a denizen of the mindscape. I mean, there are certain forms of the human condition that he had yet to experience, and unfortunately he's just now experiencing what most humans go through to some extent on a daily basis, addiction. And so the thing that hurts him about this particular revelation is that while yes, he just happened to stumble upon Dr. Fong's experiment, it's due to his actions in ignoring Ricky, the younger version of Rick. It's due to Sleepwalker himself ignoring Ricky's warnings, and basically forcing Rick to fall asleep, and that's why Rick's in the state he's in, and he may very well die because of Sleepwalker. And so Sleepwalker initially tries to track Spectra down, because he's trying to justify it in that maybe she can use the diamond to make Rick wake up somehow, or maybe she can use the diamond to help him or something like that. But unfortunately, he's lying to himself, and Dr. Fong calls him out on this, and Spectra herself does, while the two of them are fighting, because basically he's wanting to, while he is wanting to help Rick, he's also wanting to help himself, and it's in a sense of getting another hit of the light. And so basically she just gives him a full burst of all the spectrums at once, and so it's like pleasure and pain combined to a point where he starts hallucinating like crazy, and he starts seeing the humans that are walking the streets as fellow members of his race. And he part of him knows that he's still in the real world, but at the same time he's like, hey, if I can't go back to the mindscape, I'm going to bring it to me. And so he starts using his warping powers to twist the landscape, and to make it look like something resembling his home. And but unfortunately, though, while he has quite a bit of a high, from being hit with all those spectrums at once, his crash is rather bad, and he starts being, hit by these twisted, warped versions of enemies he's faced, and he starts to realize that this isn't the mindscape. I can't go home like this. I mean, this isn't home, and so he realizes just how bad off he is, and so as he goes back to Dr. Fong and tries to keep an eye on Rick Sheridan while he's in the hospital, another familiar face comes into the play. Colonel Smith from the Office of Insufficient Evidence, which was back in issues 10 through 11 of the series. And his superiors are basically haranguing him, telling him that he's basically brought, the department all sorts of negative publicity due to, his handling of the whole assignment of, trying to capture Sleepwalker. And there was also quite a bit of a lawsuit against the department from the citizens who were basically taken and experimented on to try and find out where Sleepwalker was hiding, because they were able to determine that Sleepwalker was making his home in the mind of a human being within the city. But unfortunately, though, for this organization, a lot of the citizens who were experimented on by them were very pissed off, and they had a lawsuit against them, and so they won. And so basically they're telling Smith that look, we're pulling our support from your program here. If you want to go after Sleepwalker, you got to do it on your own. And so Smith, at this point, he's pretending to go along with what they're saying, but then he's kind of got mad on for Sleepwalker at this point, and he sort of becomes obsessed with defeating him. And so he makes a call to a group of soldiers called the Thought Police. And apparently these soldiers, like with some high-tech equipment, are able to go into the mind of an individual and complete their missions from within, like maybe you're trying to find out something about someone, maybe trying to kill someone from the inside, or that kind of thing. But so the three Thought Police, or the three members of the Thought Police, plus Smith, they go to a familiar face for assistance, Mr. Fantastic, Reed Richards himself. They go to the Fantastic Four. And so, Smith, comes up with a cockamamie story that Sleepwalker is a threat to humanity and the American way of life, and they need, the expertise of Reed Richards to, track Sleepwalker down and contain him. And keep him from harming humanity any further, and because he also shows some evidence of Sleepwalker's activities in terms of him warping the scenery around him. And so Mr. Fantastic, he's reluctant to get involved with this, because he's like, he had heard conflicting reports on Sleepwalker. Yes, he's heard that Sleepwalker's caused a lot of structural damage, but he's also heard that Sleepwalker's done quite a bit of good for people throughout the neighborhood as well. And so, since the Office of Insufficient Evidence is, oddly enough, a legitimate government organization, Reed agrees to help them out, but so long as he leads the expedition, not Smith. Smith is going to stay behind while Reed goes with the Thought Police. And so the thing that they leave out, though, is that they don't tell Reed Richards that they're going into the mind of a human being. They leave that part out. they knew that Sleepwalker was inside the mind of Rick Sheridan, but they told Reed that basically they were just going into another plane of like another side of the mental plane, to try and find him, like another dimension altogether. And so once Reed Richards finds this out, once they're inside of Rick's mind, he's starting to put two and two together when the group is attacked by several enemy soldiers, which actually turn out to be toys, child toys. And as Reed is
looking at these, he's like, something's not right here. And then once it comes to light what's really going on, and Reed has irrefutable evidence that they are inside the mind of a human being. He basically tries to get them all out of there, because he realizes that with the four of them walking around inside the mind of an individual who's already in a coma. I mean, if Rick had been awake, and they'd been inside of his mind, that would have been bad enough, because who knows what kind of damage they're doing, just walking around, affecting the landscape of Rick's mind. But because Rick is in a coma, I mean, Reed realizes that they're doing, catastrophic damage just by being there. But unfortunately, while he's able to get out, the thought police basically have these jammers on them to where it prevents, Reed from using, his equipment from, pulling them out. And because they're dead set on completing the mission that Smith has given them, and that's to kill Sleepwalker, not capture him. And that's another reason why Reed tried to pull the plug on the mission, because once they find Sleepwalker, who basically made himself go back inside of Rick's mind, courtesy of Rick's dog Rambo. They were in the hospital, and Rambo, pulled along by Dr. Fong, made his way into the hospital room where Rick was staying at, and Sleepwalker was by Rick's bedside, basically just trying to look out for him and apologize to him. But Rambo came along, and Rick licked Rick's hand, and that woke Rick up just enough, and Sleepwalker was able to go inside of Rick's mind. And good timing too, because that's when he comes across the thought police and Mr. Fantastic. And there's a very interesting moment wherein Sleepwalker is calling out Reed Richards for helping these enemy forces, the thought police, and he's saying, when last I saw you, you were a hero. And Reed's like, I don't know what you're trying to pull, pal, but I have never met you before. And so, like, he'd heard of Sleepwalker, but the two of them had never met. But it turns out what Sleepwalker's referring to, is a moment in issue 3 wherein he was confronted by several dream doppelgangers of various heroes throughout the Marvel Universe, as conjured up by Rick's memories, because at this point in time, Rick's subconscious was trying to fight back against Sleepwalker and this was before Rick fully knew what was going on with Sleepwalker. And one of the heroes that came to Rick's aid within his mind was a doppelganger of Reed Richards, and that's why Sleepwalker is confused at Reed Richards helping out the bad guys. And so while Reed is able to get out of there, the thought police, they jam the frequency and they stay in the mind, to fulfill their true mission in killing Sleepwalker. And so unfortunately though, it's one of those moments where another good news, bad news situation. While Rick's mind is rapidly deteriorating, and he himself is able to go in and actually take an active role inside of his own mind, much like, say, his younger aspect in the form of Ricky, except he is himself at this point. And he sees a Sleepwalker, being attacked by these guys, and he comes in and uses his power, and uses, the power he has within his own mind, to basically warp the landscape around them and, battle the thought police. And so while he basically, saves Sleepwalker's life and puts the thought police, on the ropes for a bit, Sleepwalker's telling Rick, you have to stop. I mean, I appreciate you trying to help me, but you have to stop. By being here, you're further jeopardizing your well-being. And he's, trying to explain to Rick that while, Rick is, using his energy, his mental strength and what have you to defend himself and Sleepwalker from the thought police. By doing that, he's decreasing his likelihood of coming out of his coma. And so, Rick is like, okay, all right, I'll go along with it. But wait a minute, I'm in a coma? How did that happen? And so, because at this point, all he remembers is, just randomly falling asleep. He doesn't realize he's in a coma. And so Sleepwalker has to tell him that, yeah, I kind of did that to you. And he tries to explain what was going on with him and, his addiction issues and what have you. But at this point, Rick's like, you've got to be kidding me. And just, and kicks Sleepwalker, out of his way and throws him into the farthest recesses of his mind, to the point where, basically Sleepwalker is caught up with all these other old memories that Rick has, and they're going down the metaphorical and literal drain at this point. And so Rick's like, I'm gonna, I'm not gonna, put up with Sleepwalker anymore. I'm gonna do whatever it is I need to do to, fight these guys, as in the thought police. And so he, basically, takes the fight to them. And he nearly kills them by literally taking parts of the mental landscape and, twisting them around and what have you. Very, very effective art by Bret Blevins. But unfortunately, though, he's becoming more and more drained, more and more exhausted. And so, and it's around this point in time that Sleepwalker, he eventually finds a way to get back to Rick, and by basically going in between the spaces of the various entrances, into parts of Rick's mind, because the part of his mind where everything was draining out, that part was starting to decay as well, and so because of Rick's deteriorating mental health. And so Sleepwalker, though, was able to find spaces in between, the various entrances, and he was able to, fight his way back to where Rick was. And once, he gets to Rick, he literally knocks him out and, basically allows Rick's body to have a chance to, recuperate and try and come back from the coma. And so the thought police, they're like, okay, well, yeah, we appreciate you saving our lives, but we're still going to kill you. A mission's a mission. And so Sleepwalker, he's like, okay, you're not dealing with, the light addicted version of me anymore. You're dealing with, me at my full powers. Because it turns out that by coming back into Rick's mind and staying there, he's actually being rejuvenated, with the mental energy. Because another thing that comes up is that back in issue 7, when he fought the Chain Gang, turns out that whole story was a part of the original Infinity War storyline that Marvel had at the time. And one of the things that ends up happening is, certain events are redone or rewritten. Reality itself was rewritten to a point where the events that happened in that issue didn't happen. It was like Sleepwalker at one point in that same issue felt like he woke up from a dream, except he doesn't sleep. And so, he has this very troubling feeling that something of momentous, nature had happened, but he doesn't know why. It's like, the equivalent of feeling like someone's walking on your grave, or for him, it's the closest he'd ever feel to waking up from a dream, because his race doesn't sleep. But as it happens, though, one of the things that the readers learned in that particular issue, and that Sleepwalker learned as well, is that if he does not return to Rick's mind after a certain amount of time, he starts to get weaker and weaker within the real world. Like he can still interact with the real world, but he can't function at full power or strength. And because Rick was one of the people who vanished because of Thanos, snapping his fingers with the Infinity Gauntlet, Sleepwalker, was basically, left with no way to go back into, the mind that was his home, and so he was stuck in the real world and what have you, gradually growing weaker and weaker. And so there's a very interesting moment in this storyline in Color Blindness, wherein it's like he has a vague memory, or he has a vague impression that he's gone through something like this before, in a sense of once he's back inside of Rick's mind, he's coming to full strength, and he's like, this feels very familiar, that kind of thing. So I liked that. But once he's back at full power, though, he just goes all out on the thought police and does not hold back. And so one of the reasons that he doesn't hold back is because they're inside of they're in a sort of other dimensional state of being, where basically, Sleepwalker, unlike being in the real world, isn't limited by, the confines of, flesh and blood. Like, the mind is basically his domain, and the thought police are just, tourists there. And so he just kicks their asses, to the point where, they, get out of there as soon as they're able to get a signal through Rick's mind. And so once they're out of there, Rick starts to gradually come out of his coma. But before he does, he and Sleepwalker have a sort of heart-to-heart conversation, wherein Sleepwalker owns up to what happened and apologizes to Rick, and saying that in my desire to find a way home, or a desire to feel the peace of home, or just peace in general, I was relying on something that turned me into a monster, and because of that you were nearly killed, and I failed in my mission as a sleepwalker. And so Rick says hey, the fact that we're they basically make up, and they agree to try again, to work on being worthy of each other's trust. Like Rick says, he'll try and trust Sleepwalker some more than he has, and be more open to Sleepwalker say trying to talk with him about whatever's going on in his mind. And Sleepwalker in turn says he'll try and be more worthy of Rick's trust. And so as Rick fades away within his mind, he wakes up in the real world, and his family's all around him, and the doctors are like amazed that he's coming out, because he was this close to dying, and they hadn't really seen anything like it, as far as that kind of coma before. But in the meantime, though, the thought police and Colonel Smith, while Reed Richards and the Thing, Ben Grimm, they initially tried to keep them held for the authorities. Colonel Smith pulls basically diplomatic immunity, or basically government connections, card, sort of get out of jail free card. And fortunately, because the Office of Insufficient Evidence is a legitimate branch of the government within the Marvel Universe, Reed, tells Ben to, back down and, let them go. But not without both of them telling, Colonel Smith that you're not the only ones with friends in the government. We're going to be watching you. And so, that's how the story ends. And I gotta say, this was, as far as, Sleepwalker storylines in general, though, this is probably one of my favorites because the series had gradually been working its way towards a sort of, darker tone. And I think this was kind of like the result, of everything just sort of coming together. And, you see, how Sleepwalker, as noble as an individual as he is, basically, prey to his own, inner desires to return to the mindscape. And the fact that, humanity, for the most part is, constantly viewing him as a monster and lashing out at him, whenever he, makes his way into the real world, just trying to, help people out, that doesn't really help him either. So it's like, he's described it, the ordeal. I mean, he's a prisoner in, two worlds. On one hand, he's a prisoner in Rick's mind, and he's a prisoner in the real world. And so you can definitely understand why, someone in his situation would be more susceptible to, something that, like, say, addiction or some other form of outside influence. And so while this form of addiction is coming from something as outlandish as, a spectrum of light, it is something that, sort of strikes home, for, me personally, because, I mean, I've, talked with people who have gone through issues of drug addiction, and I've also, read, several accounts of, what, people deal with when going through addiction or trying to, kick the habit and what have you. But on the other hand, how, sometimes, people aren't able to kick the habit. Like, it's with them all their, lives. And sometimes, it ends those lives rather quickly. So I thought in terms of showing, the effects of addiction on someone who isn't human, I thought that this particular storyline did a pretty good job in showing just how terrifying it would be if someone like Sleepwalker, who, is as powerful as he is basically going unhinged. It's sort of like, the nightmares that Rick was having in issue 12, wherein, the demonic entity Nightmare, was trying to make contact with Sleepwalker, but, Rick, it's like those nightmarish scenes where Rick's seeing Sleepwalker killing people with his warp beams. It was like sort of a preview for this storyline, except thankfully Sleepwalker himself doesn't actually kill anyone. It's just he does cause a lot of damage, but you see just how nightmarish it would be for someone like him to lose control, and it's just a miracle that no one was killed. But unfortunately, though, I mean, the fact that Rick came that close himself to being killed by Sleepwalker within his own mind, I mean, it was something that's terrifying in and of itself, because within this series, we've had foes such as, Cobweb or, Lullaby, essentially, mind raping characters. And so for Sleepwalker to essentially, mind rape Rick in order to make him fall asleep, I mean, that's a pretty terrifying situation. I mean, and I like how initially there is some form of comedy in a sense that, Ricky, the younger version of Rick, is, trying to find a memory that's so boring that it'll make Rick fall asleep. And it's, it's a memory that we can relate to. I mean, we've all had, one of those teachers who, I mean, bless their hearts, I mean, are way past their prime and be like, maybe you should find another line of work, but, it's like, unfortunately, they're still there and, making the students fall asleep, that kind of thing. It's like, we can relate to that, so there's some humor in that. But at the same time, though, it's sort of a, foreshadowing of, Sleepwalker's, berserk actions, shortly after, when, he himself, forces Rick to fall asleep by tearing apart, parts of Rick's mind. And so, I liked how there was that bit of mood whiplash there. You see, like there's a bit of ominous um, tone that's kind of building up in the first part of the story, but there's still that element of comedy that was present throughout certain parts of the series. But then once Sleepwalker crosses the line and forces Rick to fall asleep, so he can get his next high, that's when you're in sort of real world horror territory, in a sense of showing the effects of addiction on someone. Except in this case, while it's a relatable thing, it's still being applied to someone who's not human, and so the effects are pretty memorable and scary. But I also I liked how the new character of Dr. Fong was brought in, and because some stories would probably have someone like him actually be turned into the bad guy as opposed to, say, his assistant, but instead Selena's the one who turns bad or turns into a villain. And Dr. Fong, though, I mean, he's not a mad scientist, he's just a scientist trying to do an experiment. And thankfully I appreciate that the story kind of sidestepped the cliche of the scientist turning into a mad scientist because of an experiment gone wrong or something. And then, granted, the experiment does go wrong, but he's actually one of the sources of stability and sanity within the story, in the sense that he's the one trying to talk Sleepwalker down and say, hey, you've become an addict. And he also goes out of his way to try and help Sleepwalker and Rick and Rick's dog Rambo. And so I like that. It's like it showed that Dr. Fong, I mean, as much as he desires to make his mark on science with his experiments, he's a good guy at heart who realizes that we have to be careful how we do things, otherwise all sorts of crazy stuff happens. Case in point, you have an alien becoming literally addicted to a spectrum of light, and then you have his assistant, whom he thought was a friend of his, basically taking the opportunity to become a supervillain. And speaking of Spectra, she's actually an interesting character, because while we don't spend a lot of time with her, there's just enough in the dialogue that we learn about her to where the theme of addiction comes up again, in the sense that you get the idea that she was addicted to the toxic relationship that she had with her boyfriend, but when she has this opportunity to seize power for herself, she actually uses that power to get out of that relationship. But she also, because her boyfriend was an addict, she recognizes that Sleepwalker is an addict as well. And so when she, defeats him in combat, I mean, she literally does so by getting him high. And, but she says, I hope it kills you. Because at this point, even though Sleepwalker's not human, she knows an addict when she sees one. And, it feels like on one hand she's equating Sleepwalker with her boyfriend, but at the same time you feel like there's a bit of self-loathing there as well, even though she doesn't want to admit it, because she herself was addicted to the toxic relationship she had with her boyfriend, which is just alluded to. But Bob Budiansky does a good enough job with writing to where you can kind of pick up on that. And so while there is a bit of dread that comes into play, in the sense that you dread the outcome of Spectra being free to roam the world, with her newfound power, you realize that there's potential for her to not only cut loose with it and do Lord knows what, because you don't know what she's going to do with this newfound power. I mean, she's out of this toxic relationship, obviously. I mean, that's a good thing, but at the same time, though, she's going doing whatever she's wanting to do, and we don't know what that is as a reader. And so someone that powerful, with that new ability, and not trained in it, I mean, who knows what damage they could do. But also, me personally, I was wondering, okay, if the spectrum of light can have an addictive effect on Sleepwalker, can it also have an addictive effect on humans, or is it just limited to members of Sleepwalker's race? And so that little bit of, sort of dread and spookiness, from the possibility that comes into play, I really appreciated that. But also, I really liked Bret Blevins' artwork. In the first two parts of the story, issues 13 and 14 were actually inked by Mike Manley, co-creator of Darkhawk, another one of my favorite heroes. But he's actually done inks on a couple of issues in this series. But then issues 13 and 14 were penciled and inked by Bret Blevins. But the artwork on a whole is really good. And both in terms of how the real world is depicted, as well as when it comes to, say, the realm of Rick's mind. I mean, there's all sorts of alien architecture and sort of a Steve Ditko-ish vibe when it comes to, say, the aspects of Rick's mind and what have you. And whenever the Thought Police and Sleepwalker and Rick are all going at it, it's really something to see. Bret Blevins, when it comes to, say, doing stuff on a, say, when it comes to, say, horror or science fiction, Bret Blevins tends to do really good work. I mean, case in point, his artwork on this particular series in general. And also, another thing I liked was that, the character of Reed Richards, as well as Ben Grimm, even though it's more of a, even more of a supporting role. It was like a supporting role of a supporting role. I mean, Reed Richards already has a supporting role in the story, but Ben Grimm, has even more of has a supporting role for him too. So it's like dun dun dun. But I really liked how they were written because Bob Budiansky is kind of a veteran of the Marvel Universe, and both as a writer and an illustrator. So he definitely had some familiarity with the characters of the Fantastic Four. I liked how they kept Reed's characterization consistent with that of a a scientist who's constantly exploring, but who has a conscience, and he has a heart. And so basically, I mean, he's willing to cross boundaries, but as soon as, say, someone is put at risk who is not a part of the mission, that's when he's like, no, we're not doing this. And so I really liked that about how he was handled like that, because Reed Richards at his best is, that kind of person. Like, if it's, he and the Fantastic Four, going to some uncharted territory, or he himself going to uncharted territory, that's one thing. But if someone is, getting forcefully involved with something like that, and he finds out about it, he's like, no, I mean, I know the risks, this person doesn't. We're not doing this we're not hurting this person. And so I really appreciated that, because you saw just how, even if it's just a supporting role in the Sleepwalker story, you saw how heroic Reed Richards was as a person. And also, as, odd as it would be for an organization like, say, the Office of Insufficient Evidence to actually have some measure of authority within the Marvel Universe, you have to consider all of the crazy things that go on in the Marvel Universe. And, you have all these fantastical elements going on, or, that make up this, crazy world that everyone in the Marvel Universe lives in. But you also have, I guess, forces of authority who are constantly trying to adapt to all the chaos. And you kind of get the idea that, the Office of Insufficient Evidence, I mean, if you put the extreme far right-wing linguistics, aside, that are used by the characters within that organization, I mean, you can kind of see where they're coming from, in the sense that, oftentimes there are situations that come up that require actions before a full body of evidence can be obtained, because sometimes there are instances where, in trying to get a sufficient amount of evidence, it costs, more and more in terms of, human life. And so for an organization, like this one to step in and say, hey, suspicion is all we need. I'm not saying they're right, but you can at least kind of understand where the organization itself is coming from. But unfortunately, in the person of Colonel Smith, you really see how, how someone in an organization like that, in a position of power, would abuse that power. Now, granted, their mission's already sketchy at best. I mean, understandable, yes, but very sketchy and, very immoral when you get right down to it, in a sense of, that they're willing to experiment on people just to get results and what have you. But Smith, though, is basically made the face of the organization, and you realize that through him, that no good can come from an organization like this being in power. So while you can understand why it would be put into place by the government, because they're constantly trying to adapt to all these crazy things happening in the Marvel universe, and Sleepwalker being one but many of them. I mean, you realize that at the end of the day, this organization that was, you get the feeling it was just kind of thrown together to try and contend with stuff like this. Like, it might have made some sense on paper, but in actuality, it's something that is like a time bomb just waiting to go off. And when you have, individuals like those that make up the thought police, being given free reign to run roughshod over the mind of a human being, regardless of how much jeopardy it puts them in, you realize that this is not a good organization, and this is something that needs to be shut down. And Colonel Smith, needs to be held accountable. And so, while it is frustrating that they pull their get out of jail free card, in a sense that they tout their government connections to where Reed Richards, even like someone as noble and good as him, has to back off and say, we have to let them go. The fact that Ben Grimm is able to turn around and say, you guys aren't the only ones with friends in the government. So it's like there's a balance there. And I don't know I don't know exactly what happens in the rest of the series. I would love to see something like that happen, where maybe the Fantastic Four come back in another story within this series and help Sleepwalker and Rick get a hold of Colonel Smith and basically shut the Office of Insufficient Evidence down. I mean, I would love to see something like that happen, but I don't know if it does. Or but the fact that they point that out, though, that, I mean, yeah, you might have friends in high places. Well, we're actually heroes who have done a lot of good for humanity, and to enough to a point where the government's owes us a few favors. So but I also liked how Rick, who for the most part has had very little control in his life at this point. I mean, at this point in time, because of the fact that he's had his life kind of turned upside down by Sleepwalker, basically being stuck in his mind. I find it ironic that one of the few instances in which he has some form of control is when he basically manifests himself inside of his own mind to help out Sleepwalker. And I liked how it was cool that he had the type of control he had to warp the landscape of his own mind into fighting the enemies. And of course, I also liked how while I sympathized with Sleepwalker's plight in a sense of him trying to find some form of peace in his state of mind of being away from home for so long, and also being confronted by prejudice from humanity on a regular basis, the fact that and also I realized that to some extent he was not in control of his actions. He also did have some control. Like, he had a choice. It was one of those things. So it's one of those areas where I understand how addiction can really mess with someone's perception, to a point where logic and morality kind of go out the window. And so I felt for him. even when I was, freaked out when, he was doing what he did with Rick's mind and, forcing Rick to fall asleep and what have you, as well as when he's, delirious and trying to, turn, the landscape of the city into something resembling his home, and causing all sorts of damage. I was kind of glad when Rick actually, took a swing at Sleepwalker, metaphorically speaking. Like basically he used, the power he had in his own mind to, basically, put Sleepwalker in timeout, kind of put him in his place, because Rick has a point, if Sleepwalker hadn't done what he did, then Rick wouldn't have been in a coma in the first place. And so, yeah, it's like I was pulling for both Sleepwalker and Rick. I mean, simply because, it's Sleepwalker's book, and Rick is the one who has Sleepwalker in his mind. But because of how chaotic Rick's life has been, because of Sleepwalker's involvement in his life, I appreciated that when Sleepwalker went out of his way to actually force Rick to sleep, or basically went out of his way to essentially hurt him, simply so he could get his next fix. I mean, I appreciated that Rick called him out on it, both verbally and physically, and for once in his life, he had the power to do so. But also, I thought it was really cool, seeing Rick, being able to fight back, against the people who were forcing their way into his mind. I mean, taking a swing at Sleepwalker's, cathartic enough. But for him to basically use the very fabric of his mind to basically just wipe the floor with the thought police, seeing as how ruthless and sadistic as they were, I mean, you're like, yes, and for once you're cheering for Rick as opposed to Sleepwalker. I mean, not to say that I didn't like Rick up to this point. I mean, I did. I really do. I mean, I appreciate that fact that he's actually a fairly original character, and he's different from, say, someone like Peter Parker and what have you. But he has his own personality and quirks and everything. But at the same time, when I was rooting for someone in the book, I was usually rooting for Sleepwalker. But this was an instance where Rick finally had some say in what was going on. With all the outlandish stuff that was going on in his own mind, and the fact that he himself was the one fighting back and putting the bad guys on the ropes. I mean, for me personally, I just found that very refreshing. And so, yeah, I mean, I really liked that, how the book sort of made you respect Rick for a change, or at least root for Rick for a change. And Rick Sheridan definitely got some points here. And also, I liked how the creative team kind of deconstructed someone like Sleepwalker within the storyline. Now, granted, things seem to be on the path to, say, rebuilding and salvation and what have you at the end of the book, when Sleepwalker and Rick sort of make amends. But I appreciate the fact that they kind of explored what would happen if someone like Sleepwalker were to lose all control, because we got, as I mentioned earlier, we did catch a glimpse of that in the nightmares that Rick had in issue 12, but to actually see it happen here, yeah, it's pretty scary. And so I liked how the creative team sort of deconstructed a character like Sleepwalker. But then again, by the story's end, though, when Rick and Sleepwalker have their heart-to-heart with one another, they realize, okay, some changes need to be made, but let's try this again, okay? And so, yeah, this was all in all a really good storyline. And sadly, the next issue, number 17, was the final issue for artist Bret Blevins to work on the series. And so, and speaking of which, instead of, when it comes to, say, like, my next comic book review, I'm actually going to be taking a break from Sleepwalker for a time because not that I don't like the series. In fact I really enjoy it. I really do, and I'm definitely wanting to see how the rest of it goes. But number 17, which like I said was Bret Blevins' last issue on the series as a regular artist, is in fact a crossover with the series Darkhawk. And it's actually part 3 of a 3-part crossover. The first parts are issues 19 and 20 of the Darkhawk series. And so if I were to review that particular crossover, there are events that had occurred there are elements within the Darkhawk series that are brought up in this particular crossover that will probably make little to no sense to those of you who maybe have only read the Sleepwalker series but hadn't read anything from the Darkhawk series, or maybe you haven't read either series, but you're listening to my reviews on Sleepwalker. And so if I just launch into this crossover without giving y'all any sort of backstory on Darkhawk, I feel like that would be a disservice to y'all. So I will be taking a break from Sleepwalker, just in terms of my next comic book reviews. My next few comic book reviews, I'll be taking a break from the Sleepwalker series and segueing into the Darkhawk series, because what I want to do is I want to review the Darkhawk series as it gets to this point within this crossover with Sleepwalker. So that way, by the time I do review this crossover storyline that Sleepwalker and Darkhawk have, you, the audience, unless you've already read the series of Sleepwalker or Darkhawk, of course, if you, the audience, have only just been listening to my reviews on Sleepwalker, so by the time I get you caught up on what's going on in the Darkhawk series, you'll understand what's going on with both Sleepwalker and Darkhawk by the time I cover the crossover storyline. So that's what I'll be doing in the near future here. Obviously, I'll be skipping around doing movie and book reviews as well. But in terms of the comic book reviews, that's what I'm going to be doing going forward. I'll be covering Darkhawk up to the point of the crossover, and then I'll be going back to Sleepwalker most likely. So, but yeah. I'm going to go ahead and give Color Blindness issues 13 through 16 of Sleepwalker 4 out of 5 stars. I mean, this was a really good storyline. I mean, there were some elements that I would say, I mean, just as say a person in the real world, I mean, there are some elements that I feel like were kind of frustrating, such as the quote unquote love story that Rick has with Alyssa, or lack thereof, because it seems like, I mean, I like the character of Alyssa. I appreciate the fact that she's like one of the few humans who genuinely sees Sleepwalker as a hero and actually tries to help him at times. But at the same time, though, the fact that she's so susceptible to a creep like Whitney is very frustrating. And basically, she's just leaving Rick high and dry. But then again, on the other hand, though, I mean, I'm kind of frustrated with Rick for, as much as I am rooting for Rick in this particular storyline, in a sense that he finally stands up for himself. I'm frustrated with him in a sense of, how he just, keeps refusing to tell Alyssa what's going on. Like he refuses to tell her the truth. And I mean, it's like if he were Peter Parker, I mean, yeah, I can understand, you don't want to tell your loved ones who you really are, because, that could get their enemies and what, coming after you, that kind of thing. But this is Sleepwalker we're talking about. I mean, he's not on the same scale as Spider-Man. And so, Rick telling Alyssa that, yeah, I got an alien in my head, and that's why my life's been so messed up, and that's why our relationship's been so messed up. So now that you know what's going on, do you think we could work this out? See, I would have loved if the two of them had a little sit down like that. If, instead of, Sleepwalker, forcing Rick to fall asleep on the train with Ricky's help in this one instance, I mean, as interesting as that part of the story was, and to an extent as amusing as it was, in the sense that they tapped into a memory so boring that Rick just had to fall asleep. I really wish that they could have done something like that later on in the story. Like they could have. I wish that the creative team had made it to where Rick made it to his date with Alyssa, or friendly get together, wherein the two of them finally talk about things to where Rick finally tells the truth. I mean, I would have loved it if they had done something like that, so that way Alyssa finally would understand what was going on, and Rick would finally realize that, hey, you know what? I can actually trust her, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, Rick, still refuses to tell her what's going on, and so, Alyssa just, kind of is like, okay, you want to be a flake? Bye. And so she's, running around with, the creep Whitney, who, I mean, is clearly cheating on her. So, yeah. But anyway, so yeah, when it comes to like that element of the story, I felt like it kind of dragged it down a bit. I mean, not to the point where it ruined the story or anything, but just like the rest of the story I thought was really good. But when it came to that part, I felt like it was kind of like a, mediocre soap opera or something. But anyway, though, yeah, colorblindness, I'm going to give 4 out of 5 stars too. I mean, it was a good story. It was well written, and the artwork by Bret Blevins, was just very well done. And it's sad to know that the very next issue is going to be the last work that he does on the series as a regular artist. I think, don't quote me, but I want to say that he did a backup story, and I think it may have been issue 25. But other than that, though, I mean, 17 is the last work on this series, and so I think that color blindness was, even though it's not the last work he does on the series, considering the fact that issue 17 is a crossover with a more Darkhawk centered story. I feel like Color Blindness was Bret Blevins' last hurrah on the Sleepwalker series. But if that's the case, I think that Bret Blevins kind of left the series in style. So that's my thought on it. So I've really enjoyed seeing Bret Blevins work on the series. I've been a fan of his ever since I saw his work on Batman Shadow of the Bat. Not so much on the New Mutants, but Shadow of the Bat, though, was my first time seeing his stuff, and he just elevated Batman when it came to say like how horrific his world could be, and so he sort of brought that horror. I feel. I don't remember if Batman Shadow of the Bat if his work on Shadow of the Bat came before Sleepwalker or after, but you definitely see that element of horror come into play with the world of Sleepwalker sometimes. But you also see that sort of lighthearted element that Bret Blevins was able to bring out in his work sometimes, and there was kind of a balance between the two. But color blindness, though, you definitely saw the more ominous side of Bret Blevins' art. So he definitely did some good work. And also, Bob Budiansky, I feel, did a really good job when it came to writing the story, because on one hand, he did a good job of, conveying, what it would be like for an alien to go through something like addiction. On the other hand, I liked how, he brought in new characters and, made them feel fleshed out in the brief amount of time they were in the book, or within these pages. And also liked how, he seemed to, give the reader just a little bit of a science lesson in terms of the light spectrum experiment that Dr. Fong was doing. And also, last but not least, I mean, I really liked how he brought in Mr. Fantastic in the story and actually made his guest appearance feel believable, in the sense of how, he made Reed Richards actually sound like he normally would, within his own book, So, all around, very good work by, both parties. So, I'll go ahead and show you all the covers here. So here's the cover for part 1, issue 13. definitely a very disturbing cover for sure. I mean, you got Sleepwalker basically splitting his own head in half, and you see, his eyes, and basically at this point, I mean, you could tell that he is addicted, and it's not pretty. But I just love how, just in the standpoint of horror, I mean, this is a very striking cover. And as it says, this is Sleepwalker, out of his mind. And you look at it and you believe it. And this is the cover for issue 14. And there's Spectra right there. Now, on one hand, okay, so one thing I will say that I felt was an issue with Bret Blevins' artwork is that, I mean, for the most part, I mean, his work on the series is very well done, but for some odd reason, part of the way through the series, prior to this storyline, Sleepwalker went from a sort of gangly, tall, long-limbed, alien-looking individual to, say, suddenly, bulking up and looking like, a cousin of the Hulk, simply because of how muscular he suddenly became, within the span of a couple of issues. And while it wasn't enough to say, ruin, the story, I did feel that, Sleepwalker, as a character looked better and more alien when, say, he was, skinny and long-limbed, as opposed to, say, muscular and, bulked up, because, I mean, there were so many muscular, characters and bulked up characters, flying around the Marvel Universe, to where it's like, he literally just looks like a cousin of the Hulk. In case in point, right here, it's like realistically, like Sleepwalker, I think would have looked better if, say, his, like his arm, instead of like the muscle being right here, if it had just been like this, if that had just been his arm, but instead it's like, and so unfortunately, this is still, Sleepwalker when he's on steroids. But I guess in a roundabout way, it's kind of appropriate because, I mean, in this story, he's an addict. So he's an addict who looks like a steroid addict here. But on the other hand, though, I really like the artwork that Bret Blevins did for the character of Spectra because, I mean, she's very beautiful to look at. And also, there's a definite sexual appeal, and I liked how, the strands of rainbow that are covering her strategically was a nice touch. But also, I forgot to mention, the colorist on this series, or at least within these stories, was a woman named Mary Javins, and the color art within the storyline was very well done. I don't remember if she's the one who did the colors for the series prior to this storyline, but for this four-part storyline, her work was very well done, especially when it came to, say, how she used colors with the character Spectra. And so, I mean, when you have a character like her with the abilities that she has, you actually want the colors to reflect that. And in this case, I mean, they did a very good job with that. So, Bret Blevins, Mike Manley working together with pencils and inks, and then you got Mary Javins, doing a fantastic job with colors. And so as a result, not only does the story itself look good, on a, color level, but the character Spectra really stands out, visually, but also from a writing standpoint as well. So she's definitely a good new villain for the series, and I'm definitely intrigued to see what they do with her later on. Okay, so here's issue 15, and Sleepwalker is not having a good day here. Getting a beat down from the thought police there. There's the three of them right there. And there's Mr. Fantastic. And no, this is not the new Fantastic Four, although there just happen to be 4 people going inside of Rick's mind at this point. So, contrary to what it looks like on the cover, within the book, Reed Richards is actually, a voice of reason, as it turns out. He's not, joyfully going along with the bad guys here or anything like that. But, at the same time, it's like,
yeah, Sleepwalker gets jumped here. Also, I thought that was a nice touch. You got Sleepwalker's face, screaming right there. And last but certainly not least, issue 16, which is, the last part of the storyline. And one of the things I appreciate about this cover art is, on one hand, on a purely visual level, I mean, this harkens back to, say, some of the old school, horror comic art that DC had, like, House of Secrets or Secrets of the Haunted House, or let's see. I mean, there were all sorts of, I think, Tales of the Unexpected, I think, was another one. But, looking at this here, you can tell that Bret Blevins was influenced by, the old school horror art of DC Comics. Just, how, organic, the horrific event looks right here. Because, I mean, this looks like something you'd see in a movie like A Nightmare on Elm Street here, which is very appropriate because, I mean, both Sleepwalker and A Nightmare on Elm Street deal with nightmares and dreams, but, I mean, here you got, Rick, standing off, taunting Sleepwalker and basically, using, the power of his mind to make the very fabric of his mind, like, lash out against him. And yes, this does happen in the comic, by the way. This isn't just a badass cover. This is, something that does happen within this issue. But that's the other thing I appreciate about this cover, is because it shows something, it reflects something that actually does go on within the story in this issue. So, not only does Sleepwalker get his ass kicked by Rick inside of Rick's own mind, along with the Thought Police, but Rick actually does put Sleepwalker in his place here. And so I thought that was, I appreciated that accuracy in terms of what the cover reflects. And I like that little corner drawing there, all the hands going into Sleepwalker's face. So that was color blindness, the sort of storyline that the series had kind of been building up to, and it just the results were very well done. I enjoyed this story, and I really want to see where the rest of the series goes. And so that was my take on it. You got any questions, comments? Please feel free to drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe. But I hope you all have enjoyed hearing about Sleepwalker from me. And if you haven't had a chance to, I would highly recommend, at some point, getting a hold of the first 16 issues of the Sleepwalker series. Because, I mean, I can't speak for the rest of the series, but the first 16 issues are, something that, in my opinion, stand out as some of the, most original work to come out of Marvel Comics in the 90s, because while 90s comics from Marvel tend to get a lot of flack, as well as 90s comics in general, the early part of the 90s, I think, had a certain amount of, creativity and originality, to them. Creative teams were not afraid to take chances. They weren't afraid to create new characters. They weren't able to push the boundaries of what characters could do with their powers and what have you. And in my opinion, the first 16 issues of Sleepwalker were definitely, I guess you could say, a positive example of a 90s comic book hero. Because also another thing is that, as freaky and menacing as Sleepwalker looked, it turns out he was actually one of the more heroic characters from the 90s anti-hero fad, in the sense that Sleepwalker actually was a hero. Now granted, in this particular storyline, I mean, he goes through the disease of addiction and becomes one of the very monsters that he's trying to fight, unfortunately. But I mean, at the same time, though, it's a very relatable, struggle that he goes through. But prior to this, though, I mean, you definitely see him as, someone who was to be commended for putting up with the prejudice of humanity and yet still trying to do his best to, help humanity out and to safeguard the mind of,
the person who is being forced to contain him. And so yes, Sleepwalker was definitely a book, at least within the first 16 issues, that challenged a lot of the notions that people had of comic book series from this point in time. And I would even say that if you're someone who sort of tends to pish posh and dismiss 90s comics in general, I would say at least give the first 16 issues of Sleepwalker a chance, because I think that you'll be pleasantly surprised. So but yeah, that'll do it. Thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. Y'all got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. Y'all have a good evening, have a good Friday. Bye.